There we go. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tech Chat. Well, now it's Wednesday. So, Tech Chat Wednesday/Tuesdays for Wednesday, March 8th, 2023. I'm Ken Rimple, and I'm joined today by Michael Hulet. Hi, Michael.
Hey.
Michael works for us at Chariot Solutions. We're going to talk about his background with iOS development and accessibility in a little bit. We're going to start off real quick with some housekeeping today. First thing is on our Chariot blog, we have a couple new blog articles, one of which has just come out analyzing glue jobs with AWS X-Ray. Keith Gregory did this particular blog post. So if you want to go in and debug and see what's going on with an AWS glue job, he kind of sets you and steps you through it. And the reasons why it's hard to trace it and like what you can do to trace jobs through the system, like a Python shell job or something like that. So if you're doing AWS and you happen to be using glue, that might be really useful for you. Another thing coming up, and it's our big thing I really want to address more than anything else, is our upcoming Philly Emerging Technologies for the Enterprise Conference 2023. We are getting to the point where we're getting close to selling out our in-person tickets. So right now, I think we have a couple dozen left. And when they go, there are no extras. There are online only tickets as well. And the prices are very reasonable. So if you look at the register now link, you'll see that I believe it's $150. I forget the numbers on here. I should know this by heart by now, but I can't remember anything. There we go. $150 or $425 at the moment. So $425, while I believe it's still early bird, if I'm correct. Yes, it says early access, is going to get you the in-person ticket as well as a live stream link if you happen to be running late or you can only make one day of the conference. If you can't come in person, we have an unlimited number of live tickets, so you can certainly purchase those and watch us remotely. We will be streaming all of the events, so you won't miss any of the talks. We'll be doing 2 tracks at a time, and all of them will be online. And then you can go back and watch them later. We eventually do make them public for everybody to see. And so, for example, there's the YouTube link. Hold on. You'd think I'd type this every time. But at youtube.com/Chariot Solutions, sorry, you'll see playlists, and you can go in and see all the ETE years that we have archived. Also, there's a super playlist with tons and tons and tons of videos with lots of speakers. This year, we have a lot of great talks as usual. Some of the speakers we have include let's see, Kishiki Aranki. He's a senior developer at DBT Labs. DBT is a big data movement tool, data engineering tool. So he's going to be talking about DBT. We've got people like Stephen Augustus, who is the head of open source at Cisco, Open Source Security Foundation. We've got Deshaun Carter from Spring Developer Advocate on VMware Tanzu, talking about multi-platform, multi-cloud. We've got our own Drew DeCarn talking about UI and UX. He is, I believe, talking about doing web workers, or I should say service workers, if I remember correctly. So he's talking about a technical topic there. We've got Richard Feldman coming back again. A lot of really good speakers in here. Yehuda Katz coming in, who created Ember.js, worked on the Rust and Ruby teams, and also is creator Starbeam.js, which is his talk. So just a lot of really good speakers. Very much worth your time, very much worth your money. If you are coming in from Philly, it's nice to actually get people together again. So, we're doing an in-person conference, but also you can still watch it live remotely. So again, that's at phillyemergingtech.com, and, get your tickets now before they sell out. But one of the things I want to talk about today, and the reason I brought Michael on, is Michael has a background in accessibility in iOS. So I'd like to start off by just talking a little bit about you and your background. So Michael, why don't you tell people who you are?
Yeah, hey, I'm Michael. I build and hack iPhone apps. So I've been doing that since, I guess, like iOS 6 or so. Wow, it's been a bit over a decade now.
Mm-hmm.
As far as accessibility goes, I'm not sure I necessarily consider myself an accessibility expert more than just an engineer who cares about accessibility and such.
Mm-hmm.
Greatly stems from the fact that lots of disabled people I care about. I'm disabled myself. I have ADHD, which is a cognitive disability. Software should be designed for everyone because over 30% of the world is disabled. So it's an important thing to implement and think about upfront when you're building your apps.
Okay. So why don't we set a baseline for the discussion then? So let's start just by talking about what the current accessibility standards are that we should care about as developers, especially on iOS.
Yeah. So in general, all software should generally conform to the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You might hear this often as the WCAG. It has 3 levels to it. There's just A, AA, and AAA, each increasing in I guess you could say the quality of your implementation. That in general, you should try to aim for level AA, which is generally considered to be like baseline, like I have good accessibility support. It's also what many court systems in the, I'm not a lawyer, so don't take
No
but
problem.
many court systems across the world, including the United States, will often require you to meet at least that, depending on your specific circumstances and such. Like I said, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, requires you to do so, but like I said, over about 30% of the world is disabled, so you should generally not be closing yourself off to 30% of users anyway. Likewise, on iOS specifically, the Apple Human Interface Guidelines go into some good depth about what's available on Apple platforms in specific. You should generally read all of the human interface guidelines when you're designing an app anyway. It gives some great guidance and advice, but its accessibility portions are also particularly detailed.
Okay. So in that case then, so you'd mentioned like basically the liability potential things here, right? So have you heard of specific cases that you can think of? And I don't want to put you on the spot, but reasons why companies get sued for ignoring some of these guidelines. Are you aware of any specifics?
Yeah, so I mean, like, if you're looking for recent cases, sure. There's one of the big landmark cases about this was, I think, like 5 or 6 years ago. Twitter lost before the Supreme Court on this. I forget exactly what the case was. It is, but essentially, it was the U.S. court system affirming that yes, the Americans with Disabilities Act does apply to software. Disabled people do have a right to access in the digital world as well as the physical. Recently, they've been litigating through. This isn't really as much of a problem on iOS in particular, but lots of websites. There are companies out there which their product is to add like an overlay to your website, or if you ever go on a website and see the little like blue circle with the human, like the Da Vinci drawing in it at the bottom, often you'll be able to click on that and you get like a pop-up with a bunch of options. Those often do more harm than good.
Yeah.
So they've been litigating whether that represents a site making their best effort to be accessible and conform to the ADA. Different courts have ruled different ways, as I think the general consensus is turning into that's not enough. Though, like I said, that's not really that common on iOS because there hasn't been those companies generally haven't shipped mobile SDKs. It's more of a web thing right now.
Got it. Okay. All right. So you had some things. We were just kind of like talking pre comparing notes and things like that. So some of the things you think developing teams might want to be doing to kind of keep track of things and accessibility. What do you think would help out a set of developers in kind of improving their accessibility and communicating and things like that?
Yeah, so first and foremost, it is very important that you actually get feedback from disabled users, because I think this is a common problem that all engineers face when you're building your own things or just building things in general. You write software for yourself and think, well, I'm a user, and then that's good enough for testing usability, but it's really not, because there's not really nobody is the same as any other person. I read this quote an hour or two ago about like a swimmer, a surfer, a submariner, etc. Jacques Cousteau all understand the ocean, but they understand it differently.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Um, uh, and so your perspective alone isn't sufficient to ensure that you are building truly accessible software. You need to make sure that people who actually have the disabilities you're designing for use the features that you're building. It's actually usable for them, because it's actually fairly easy to build an experience that feels accessible to you but isn't actually accessible to the people who need it. Likewise, there is a great tool in in Xcode. If you go into the like developer tools section, it's where you'll find stuff like the simulator, file merge, instruments. There's also the accessibility inspector, which will automatically audit your app on, or at least the screen that's open, on your conformance to various WCAG guidelines, how well you're using system accessibility features, and it'll flag issues for you. Now, that'll often give a lot of false positives, so take those with a grain of salt, but it's a great way to get going. Generally, I would run that before making a pull request. If I'm reviewing a PR, would run that, make sure that is generally conformant. Like I said, use your head, because it will flag some false positives sometimes. Audit it. Have a person who actually uses the features you're building audit it. Pay attention to it as you build, because it's really important to do it from the beginning. It's not really something you can just add on later. It's a lot easier if you think about it from the start and build it with it in mind from the start.
Okay. Now, you've been working with iOS since iOS 6, right? So I know that iOS has gone through lots of like evolution. You were developing on, Objective-C and C++ and things like that in the past. And then it's moved into Swift, and the various versions have changed, like skeuomorphism went away. What was the journey like with dealing? I mean, how long have you been working, first of all, with the accessibility stuff? And are you aware of, like, as iOS matured, how it went with accessibility over time?
Yeah, so over time, Apple has added a lot of interesting features that oftentimes you don't necessarily need to do anything from a developer standpoint. Like some of the most revolutionary accessibility features that have come around have been like, I remember a few years ago they added this feature where it divides the screen into grids, and then say tap this thing, so that prior to that, there really wasn't a great way to use apps that didn't think about accessibility whatsoever, but it opened up a whole new world it makes it at least like possible to do things with it. I'm not saying that that it's not important to think about the accessibility APIs anymore because of that, but it at least is a shim to make it possible if you don't. And that was a fairly big thing over the years. Anyway, as time progressed, I think the one of the bigger ones in recent years has been just the advent of SwiftUI. The way SwiftUI works as opposed to UI. So UIKit was a very imperative UI framework. You had it reads like label.text equals .frame equals do this, rather than I want an interface that looks like this. And so when you have a declarative descriptive kind of UI definition language, it allows the system to infer lots more things about how your content is laid out and how it should be interpreted by the accessibility tree. Of course, very other great things that you can use have been introduced. I had one in my mind a second ago, but like I said, I am disabled and have.
I know how that works. Yeah,
my head. Yeah. One of the big ones I use all the time. It was added in iOS 15. This isn't an API thing, but it has background sounds. So for people with cognitive disabilities like me, this white noise can really sort of calm down my thoughts and focus them into one thing. So I use that a lot when I'm developing. Just in iOS 16, they added it will attempt to add live captions to any video, audio content system-wide that you can turn on. That's still, they've marked as beta, but it can be very helpful. So yeah, certainly grown over time. Apple has been putting a lot of work into making it such that you don't have to do as much to have good accessibility support, which is great because you can control things from the system and not have to think about as much.
Right. And in terms of like, the actual like writing tests and things like that for some of these things. So obviously getting people who have the disabilities that they're struggling with to use the system is really important because you want to make sure that the interactions go well. But are there ways to test some of these features from a testing framework perspective as well?
So actually, I'm glad you brought that up because the way that UI tests work on iOS, and I believe Android as well, that actually goes through the accessibility tree. So building a good accessibility support makes your regular code more maintainable also, because if you are going to write things like UI tests, which you absolutely should do, you have to have good accessibility support, because XCUI test reads the accessibility tree to know whether or not things are on screen, what things say, etc. It works just like VoiceOver does. Now, accessibility is way more than just VoiceOver, and this is one of those examples. All accessibility tech like switch control read from this tree. So making sure that you configure it well, set your labels, set identifiers, etc., is really important, and it can lead to it generally will lead to more maintainable, easier to read and reason about code, just in general.
And between iPad and iPhone, if you're writing those apps, are there different things you need to approach based on the form factors? Or is it just really stick to good accessibility guidelines and you're going to have the same issues with both types of platforms?
So iPad OS is just a marketing name for iOS. Like,
right.
It's the same software, same apps, etc. iPad does give you more screen real estate to play with.
That's what I was thinking. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So if you turn up your dynamic type setting, for example, which is for those who aren't iPhone users, it's where you can set like your base font size in the system. For if you so you'll have lots more room for like very super tall text sizes. However, you also need to consider that iPad OS allows for like multi-window apps. So you have apps in like a slim bar on one side that's basically an iPhone form factor. So you still need to consider that. Generally, the guidance is if you have like horizontal layouts, SwiftUI and UIKit both expose like, are you using an accessibility font? And if so, you should switch to a vertical layout in those cases to make more room for text to expand and wrap. You should be making sure your text can wrap, by the way, because UI label by default only has one line. It's a I don't appreciate that. That should be 0 by default, so it can scale to whatever's necessary. Likewise, I think it defaults to the truncation mode to be just like make an ellipsis. In general, that should always be word wrap. So one of the first things I do whenever I start a new project is I extend UI label or make a subclass or something to set those, so I don't really have to think about it up front. That said, SwiftUI does the reasonable thing by default here, and text will wrap, grow however big it needs, take as many lines as it needs, so you don't have to think about as much with SwiftUI. Also, make sure you are always putting your views in, like making your screens root scroll views. There really shouldn't ever be a view that just doesn't scroll, because as text grows, things will get forced off the screen. Because you can't just think about when you're building an app you're going to support iPhone in almost all ways. You don't have to, I guess. But even on iPad, think about like iPad mini on that small form factor. Turn out the font really big, things are going to get shoved off the bottom. and then like critical controls won't be accessible, critical information won't be readable. So it's really important to always put the root of your hierarchy that's being displayed in a scroll view as well.
How about when you're designing the application? So I'm thinking of, for example, people with low vision or blind, you can't see. What about like how you design the application usability and access to things? Are there things you want to avoid doing in an iOS application that maybe if you weren't aware of that, you wouldn't do?
So avoiding doing, in general, when I've been working with designers, it's just been helpful when the designer thinks about it in general,
Mhm.
because I've had to go back and say things like, oh, what do I do in this case with these accessibility settings turned on? And designers are just like,
Yeah,
is never helpful, because then I have to make a decision as an engineer, and I'm not a designer, so I might not
right.
make the best decision. I think to think about things that like no-nos that I've seen recently. I was working with a client where we had a view where it was like, to do this, click here. Um, that here bit is provides a that's not a good accessible experience, because here is not a big word, that's not a big tap area.
Right.
Generally, if you have something that's tappable on screen, it should be at least 44 by 44 pixels. That's the minimum area that like even a normal like non-disabled human can target with their finger. So if you have like
Uh-huh.
motor disabilities, for example, like that's going to be very hard, or like very visual spatial disability where like things move around on you. That's you're not going to be able to target that easily. Likewise, if you are a voiceover user, screen reader, you can set it has this concept of a rotor, in which you can, so like imagine you have like a really long like news article, for example.
Mhm.
You have headlines, subheadlines, a bunch of body text, maybe some ads in places, links to go other. That's a lot of stuff going on. So if you're going to be swiping through that and having your phone read each and every one of those to you, it's going to take a very long time to get through a whole article web page like that. So in order to mitigate that, you can set voiceover to tell you, okay, I only want the headings right now, or I only want body content right now. One of those options is links. So imagine you're going through the link filter or the link rotor with voiceover, and you get to a link that just says here. What are you supposed to do with that? Um, so that's a big one I've seen recently. Uh, Generally, voiceover tries to parse the screen for you, and it does a relatively good job, goes from top left to bottom right.
Mhm.
Just be thinking about what users of voiceover, etc., will be hearing when they use each of those rotors. There are lots and lots and lots of settings that you should be conforming to, like reduce motion, for example. Like if you have some really complex pretty animation, like looks great, cool, but if I have like epilepsy or something, for example, that
Yeah.
could kill you. So you need to make sure you're respecting reduced motion, have a good experience if you have that turned on, just like any of the other um, settings. Another great one. Do your best to make sure you are differentiating UI elements without using solely color, because colorblind people exist. I remember, this is anecdote story, but I remember I grew up in suburban Nashville. I live out in Boulder, Colorado now. But when I was in Nashville, my church that I was going to at the time, we went on this retreat out to, if you know the area, Fall Creek Falls State Park. It's there's a waterfall in the middle of the forest, a bunch of hiking trails, very, very beautiful area. We went out there in the fall time, which is a funny time to go to Fall Creek Falls. But anyway,
Apropos of nothing. Yeah.
anyway, yeah. So all the leaves were turning orange and red. It was very beautiful. I actually didn't know one of the guys that I was there with was colorblind. I just never known that about him, even though it was years. And so we were hiking along one of these hiking trails, and we stopped for a second because they had these binoculars so you could look out over the valley with all the trees and the leaves changing and the waterfall in the background. And they had just installed a couple of those like stationary binocular things that had chroma lenses on it, so colorblind people could see the color and the beauty of the state park while we were
That's
there.
great.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so he looked through it, and he was talking about it for like 3 days afterwards.
That's so cool.
It was great. But anyway, for people like him, it's important you differentiate UI elements without using colors, because that won't be meaningful to people who can't perceive color. Now, there is a setting you can turn on in settings that like specifically flags like I need you to differentiate things without colors. So you can often get away with building UIs that use color as markers. But you need to always respect that flag. I think one of the best examples I've seen of it recently is in the fitness app, which is like activity on Apple Watch, the like rings thing.
Mm-hmm.
Notice all the rings are like the red one's your move ring, the green one's your exercise ring, the blue one's your stand ring. They all have icons here as well.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Denote like this one's standing, this one's exercise, this one's just calorie burn.
Right.
So that's a good example. Also, I did exercise this morning just to show that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you should it greatly involves being aware of what settings are available and making sure that if you're going through a design, think about like, oh, will this run contrary to one of those? Likewise, think about the people who are going to be using this above all else. Will this trigger something in someone or will someone not be able to perceive this? How can I mitigate that?
Right. Reduce flashes, for example, for triggering people that way. And if you have too many flashes a second, that's a real problem. So if your alerts flash on the screen, you have a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
Not such a great idea, and I know I had a family member with Parkinson's and was trying to get them to use an iPad, and we had to turn on all the slow tap features and things like that just to get it to work. And it was something that you didn't think about unless you ran into someone with that disability or just had been exposed to it. So yeah, it's good to know that there's like the auditing features that exist as well in Xcode. That's really great.
Mm-hmm. This would be super helpful.
Mm-hmm. And those are really good tips, by the way, too. In terms of like color schemes and things like that, like you were talking about, like, the differentiators for people who are colorblind or low color or low vision. Are there things that you work with a designer on for that? Like where you can, or is it more now it's more automatic when you go into low color mode, the iPad, it tries to make, or iPhone tries to make them more contrasty by default?
Yeah. So, accessibility is generally a design discipline. Like we can do this. We have to care about it as engineers as well, because we have to implement it. But designers should really be the ones thinking about this and leading the charge on what the app should do with various accessibility experiences, because it's a first class part of the interface. Just like you wouldn't ship an app with like, I don't know, the whole screen was red and wouldn't do anything. Like that's not that's imagine if like Twitter or Facebook or something did that. That'd be in the Washington Post.
Yes.
So if your app doesn't work with voiceover, that's exactly the same thing. If your app doesn't work with any accessibility feature, that's exactly the same thing. That's an A1 like you need to fix this immediately, hot fix kind of issue. Now I know I went off on a side tangent there. I sort of forgot your original question.
It was about colors and like color schemes and things like that.
Oh yeah,
So
okay, cool.
yeah, because I've seen plenty of applications where you look at it and go, who came
yeah,
up with that scheme, man?
yeah. So they generally the content, I think it's 4.5 to 1 ratio of like black to white to be legible. Don't quote me on that. The WCAG says it,
Sure.
enumerates it exactly. This is one of the things the accessibility inspector will flag for like this text is too like illegible against this color background.
Low contrast. Yeah, right.
Um, uh, W3 has been also recently redefining exactly what, excuse me, ratios there and how they're calculated. But I think 4.5 to 1 is the general standard. That said, so as well, iOS supports both like light mode and dark mode. That isn't billed as an accessibility feature, but it's absolutely something that people use for accessibility. So like people with low vision could have an easier time with light mode because bright background puts more light onto their retinas and makes text stand out better. And dark mode could be great for people who like get migraines, for example.
Right.
You should definitely be thinking about supporting both of those. I feel like I haven't seen a lot of apps recently that do, but you should definitely be thinking about that. Too sharp contrast can be a problem as well. Like I just mentioned, like if you get migraines, then flashing high contrast things will often trigger one of those, and that would be bad to do to your users. So
it amazes me sometimes when I'm and this is not an accessibility thing, but it's more of from someone who doesn't think they are using that feature yet. But my eyes are starting to degrade as I get older, and like I know that if I try to read an article in like white text on a background, and because you could do that, you can kind of invert it. It hurts. Like I mean, I get after images. It's like hard to digest. The text, you can't focus on them because you're so. It's such a bright, searing, intense white against this really dark background, and it really kind of like is jarring to me. But flip it over, and for whatever reason, for me, the light background's better with the dark text. So more like what a book has in it, So I understand. I've been the type of person who always has the light backgrounds too, and some people look at me and go, "How can you work with that bright background?" I'm like, "Well, I can see everything."
Yeah,
so who knows,
exactly. That's a great example of it. So it's important to support both of those.
Yeah.
In settings, you can also turn on. In the olden days, you just had pure like invert colors, where it would turn all the whites black and all the blacks white, but also all the oranges blue and all the reds green. It also they support smart invert now, which attempts to just invert text and backgrounds and not things like images. But that isn't perfect. It would be much better to support just light and dark mode as is anyway, which isn't actually all that hard. UIKit and SwiftUI both do a lot of that work for you. If you use rather than setting label colors to like black or white, for example, just set it to like system background or foreground
like
color.
Primary or whatever it is. Yeah, right.
And so you both UI color from UIKit and color from SwiftUI will know that it should be respecting the system light dark light or dark mode setting. So without you having to write any more code, it will automatically be white in light mode, be black in dark mode, or vice versa. Semantic colors are important. Use those.
Cool. That's great. How about in terms of as you're talking about this and researching this and looking into the features, are there particular like websites, podcasts, books that you would recommend to people to look at?
Yeah. So there was you asked me this question last night, and my mind instantly went blank, even though there are a billion things in there.
That sometimes happens with tech because like you work with it every day and you don't need that guide. But then when it's time to tell to somebody else, you're like, what do I tell them that I don't need to read anymore? Because I already know this chunk of beginning material, that sometimes can be a challenge for this stuff. I found one book I was wondering if you heard about, Shelley Brisbane, iOS Access for All. Have you ever heard of that one?
I'm certain I have before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I get
she's been
a
doing
lot
it
of
for every version of iOS since I don't know how long ago, but she keeps updating it every time there's a new release. It's her 10th edition of this thing, and it looks like it's a really good guide. Now, I don't know if it's a programming guide or more of a user guide. I have to check into that, but that's one thing. So I don't know.
Yeah, sounds like a great read. I generally get lots of my news just from following specific accessibility designers
Yeah.
and disabled people on social media like Twitter, Mastodon, etc. I think one of my favorite bots recently has been at A11Y awareness. A11Y that actually grew out of you'll hear abbreviations like that sometimes, like I18N.
Yeah, internationalization. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That actually grew out of the early days of Twitter and things like internationalization, accessibility communities growing on Twitter, which is
Yeah.
for having a character limit. And accessibility is a really long word, so if you use that 2 or 3 times in a tweet, then you'll run out of space fast to actually write your tweet. So it gets shortened to A11Y. Total side tangent, I know. That's so. Anyway,
And that's on Mastodon too, you said now?
yeah, it's on
Cool.
at A11Y awareness on Twitter, at A11Y awareness at disabled.social on Mastodon's a good one. Let's see, I talked to there's a Rob Whitaker gave me a lot of guidance on this. Accessibility London does stuff fairly frequently. Also, keep up to date on just the Apple Human Interface guidelines. They update those every year, every time they release a new operating system with guidance on how to use all of it. And the World Wide Web Consortium as well, the people who do W3C and the WCAG regularly publish updates. In fact, they actually have a draft of a new version of WCAG set to go be published, finalized next month. So now's a good time to get in on that and give feedback if you want to do that.
That's version 3, I think. Is that right? Is that right?
I forget if they're doing
Or 2.1, I don't know.
or 2.2 if it's going to be 3. I think.
Yeah, I was flipping through and I have no idea whether I'm right about that. I'm completely pulling that out of like quick searches.
Yeah.
So who knows? Yeah.
I think 3 is in development. 2.2
okay.
is what they're staging for next month.
So and this person, Shelley, Shelley Whitaker, I forget already the name. I'm so sorry. It's terrible of me. But anyway, her book, she was saying that like up until recently, accessibility didn't, and this is 2020 with this podcast I was listening to, she was talking about this. She said up until about 2020, Apple didn't actually have a whole section of their user guide on accessibility. Then they finally said, you know what, now with enough, these changes and these things they've been making, that they actually now have a whole section of the guide on accessibility. So absolutely go to the user guide, look at all the things that can be done and that you can then respect and use and take advantage of in your applications.
100%. When the human interface guidelines generally try to surface relevant information as you're getting to it. So if you're at the part on like rendering text in a label, then they'll mention things like, here's how you do it when the user is using a right to left language. Here's how you do it when the user has various accessibility settings. And so it used to be they only had accessibility settings or accessibility information in line throughout the guide like that, but they did make a separate accessibility setting or section fairly recent, like you said, in 2020, that generally enumerates good guidance and mindset in your designing. The WWDC videos on accessibility, there has a whole section on accessibility. Like that's a tag you can filter for. Those are also awesome. Very, very good, often better than the Apple documentation. I should note when you're looking for when you're designing content, it's great to have it in different formats, like text,
Yeah.
like video, because I've read unfortunately few books on programming, because one of the features of ADHD is that I just don't have the attention span to read a book.
Yeah. I
But
understand that.
yeah, things like well, like this, we can go back and look at this recording later. Hopefully there are people watching right now that are getting benefit from this. I can put on a video and do something else with my hands, and then that calms enough of my brain that the part of it, my brain that wants to think about accessibility, can listen to this video and gain from it.
Yeah.
Different formats and things like that help too.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, that's a really good kind of introduction. I know we might have a few more podcasts coming up in the future. We'll see if we can like line them up for talking about iOS in other areas too. So it'd be great to kind of bring you on another time or two and see what you want to talk about.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay.
I can. I'm very passionate about the software. I care a lot about the users and engineers I work with and the software I build. So I can be happy to come back and yell about plenty of different topics.
Nothing wrong with that. All right, Michael. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and being our guest. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a great time.
All right. Thank you very much. And for everybody, we'll see you soon in a couple of weeks.